Sarah Mercer had been in the Harlan building exactly 41 days when they destroyed her. She had counted. She was the kind of person who counted things, a habit she'd developed somewhere between her mother's hospital stay and the years that followed, when counting felt like the only control left. 41 days of arriving early. 41 days of staying late. 41 days of learning the language of this world, which was not the language of normal people. It was the language of old money and older grudges, of deals made in rooms with no windows, of men who smiled at you while measuring whether you were worth keeping. She should have paid closer attention to the smiling. The Harlan Group occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. From the outside, it looked clean. Modern. The kind of building that invited you in. From the inside, once you'd been there long enough, you understood it was a mouth. It swallowed people. It digested them slowly. And, if you were very unlucky, you found out what happened to the ones it spit back out. Sarah had been brought in by Daniel Reeves, a senior analyst who had recruited her straight out of her master's program at Northwestern. Daniel was 62, had the posture of a man who had once been punched in the gut and never quite straightened back out, and wore the same brown cardigan 3 days a week. He was the most decent person in the building, which is to say he was also the least powerful. "You're smart," Daniel had told her, during her second interview, leaning across his desk like he was sharing a secret. "You see patterns other people miss. The Harlan Group needs people like that." He paused, tapping his pen against his palm. "Keep your head down the first few months. Learn the room before you speak in it." Sarah had nodded like she understood. She hadn't understood. She was 26 and had never worked anywhere that required you to learn a room before speaking in it. She had grown up in Rockford, Illinois, in a house where you said what you meant and meant what you said, and nobody had the energy for games because there was too much actual work to do. Her mother had cleaned offices. Her father had left when Sarah was 9, which was not a dramatic departure so much as a gradual disappearance, the way fog lifts, one morning you just notice it's gone. She had gotten herself to Northwestern on scholarship and sheer stubbornness. She had graduated top of her cohort. She had been the best in every room she'd walked into. The Harlan Group was the first room where being the best made things worse. She understood that now. She understood it fully, in the way you only understand things after they have already finished happening to you. The inner circle of the Harlan Group was called, officially, the Advisory Council. Unofficially, everyone called it the Court. It met on the 42nd floor, in a room with dark wood paneling and a table that seated 20 and always had exactly 20 people around it. The 20 people were not the same 20 people every month, which was how Victor Harlan maintained order. He rotated the seats, kept people uncertain, made loyalty a renewable contract rather than a permanent one. Victor Harlan. If you had asked Sarah to describe him on day 1, she would have reached for the obvious words. Tall. Dark-haired. The kind of face that looked like it had been assembled by someone who had studied attractive faces academically and, then, executed the assignment without any warmth. He was 38 and ran a company worth $4 billion and had never, in Sarah's presence, laughed. Not once. He smiled occasionally, the way a house settles, a small shift, a creak, nothing that meant anything. The staff called him the Vampire King behind his back. Not because of anything supernatural. Because of the way he drained rooms. You walked in with energy and ideas and a sense of your own weight in the world, and he looked at you once, and by the time the meeting ended you were somehow smaller than when you'd arrived. Not through cruelty, he was rarely cruel, not obviously, but through a kind of absolute precision. He identified the exact thing you were uncertain about and rested his attention there. Just rested it. Like a stone placed on a tender spot. Sarah had been immune to it, mostly. Or she'd thought she had. She had been assigned to the strategic analysis team, working under Daniel, producing reports on market positioning and competitive landscape. She was good at it. The numbers made sense to her the way stories made sense to other people. They had structure, they had tension, they had a beginning and an end. Within her first 3 weeks, She had flagged an acquisition target that 2 senior analysts had missed, a mid-size logistics firm in Ohio that connected to 3 of the Harlan Group's existing holdings in ways that weren't visible until you stacked the data at the right angle. Daniel had looked at her report for a long time. Then, he'd said, "I'm going to present this to the council." "I can present it," Sarah said. Daniel had looked at her in the way he sometimes did, with something between admiration and worry, the way you look at a person walking too close to the edge of something. "Give it a few more weeks," he said. She gave it 3 days. She sent the report directly to Victor Harlan's assistant with a cover note. Professional. Concise. The kind of note that said, "I know what I'm doing and I know you know it." The assistant forwarded it. Victor read it. And, 2 days later, Sarah received a calendar invite for the quarterly court meeting, 3rd week of October, 42nd floor, 9 a.m. She was on the agenda. She thought it was recognition. The morning of October 19th, Sarah wore the blazer she'd bought specifically for serious moments. Navy blue, well-cut, the kind of blazer that said she belonged somewhere with a table like that. She arrived at 8:50. The room was already half full. 20 leather chairs around a table the color of dried blood. Pale winter light through floor-to-ceiling windows. The kind of room that had absorbed decades of decisions and showed none of them. She knew some of the faces. Marcus Vane, the group's head of acquisitions, sat 3 seats to the left of the empty chair at the head of the table. Marcus was 44, silver-haired, and moved through rooms like he owned the floor beneath them. He had been with Victor for 15 years. He had, in those 15 years, outlasted every other senior figure in the building. Sarah had noticed him noticing her, twice, in the corridor. Not in a way she could name or report. Just noticing. Elena Harlan, Victor's younger sister by 4 years, sat directly across from Marcus. Elena managed the company's public affairs and looked the part, angular and polished, with the kind of beauty that doubles as a barrier. She had not spoken to Sarah directly since Sarah joined. She had, however, mentioned Sarah's name in 2 separate conversations that Sarah had not been meant to overhear. The content of those conversations had not been complimentary. The others Sarah knew by name and role, not by personality. The court was not a place people revealed personality. Victor arrived at 9 exactly. He did not hurry. He sat. He opened the meeting. 3 agenda items before Sarah's. She sat through them. She watched the room. She noticed that when Victor spoke, everyone went still in a way that was not the stillness of respect but the stillness of people trying very hard not to be noticed by something large and unpredictable. She filed this away. She would understand it later. Her item came up. Victor introduced it the way you introduce a piece of evidence, neutral, factual, no warmth. Mercer has submitted a market analysis on Clearwater Logistics. She'll walk us through it. Sarah stood. She had presented before. She was good at it. She moved through the data cleanly, hitting the connective tissue between Clearwater and the group's holdings, laying out the acquisition case with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed it enough times that it stopped feeling like rehearsal and started feeling like truth. She finished. Looked around the table. Marcus Vane was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not hostile. Not approving. Calculating. The way you look at a problem you haven't decided what to do with yet. Victor looked at the table for a moment. Then, he looked at her. "This is incomplete," he said. Sarah waited. He would say more. He always said more. That was how this worked. He didn't say more. "The methodology is sound," she said. She did not make it a question. "The methodology is undergraduate level," Victor said. "You've identified a surface connection. You haven't investigated the liability structure, the workforce integration cost, the regulatory exposure. This report would not be useful to this council." He paused. "It would not be useful to any serious organization." The room was completely still. Sarah's hands were flat on the table. She was very aware of her hands. She kept them flat. I can expand the analysis, she said. That won't be necessary, Victor said. I think what this demonstrates is that the analytical team needs to be more careful about what it brings to this table. Mercer, and here he looked at her with something that felt like complete and utter indifference, which was somehow worse than contempt, is not ready for this level. This report is not ready for this level. We'll move on. He moved on. The room moved with him. Sarah sat back down. She did not allow herself to react. She was very good at not reacting. Years of practice. The kind of practice that starts in childhood when you learn that reacting gives the bad thing more power. She sat through the remaining agenda items. She left the room when dismissed. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button for 38, stood in the small mirrored box going down. She looked at her own face in the elevator mirror. She looked like someone who had just been told, in front of 20 people, in a room on the 42nd floor, that she did not exist. She did not go back to her desk immediately. She went to the bathroom on 38, ran cold water over her wrists, a thing she'd done since college, since the worst semester, the one she didn't talk about, and stared at the grout between the tiles until the ringing in her ears subsided. Her report had been thorough. She knew it had been thorough. She had triple-checked every figure, every connection. She had done more than the assignment required. She had been called undergraduate level, in front of the entire court, by a man who had not read the full report. She was certain he had not read the full report. Because if he had, he would have seen what she'd seen. He would have seen the thing about Marcus Vane. It was buried. She had buried it herself, uncertain whether to include it, deciding finally to leave it in the appendix as a footnote, a discrepancy in the Clearwater financials that, when traced back, connected through two shell companies to a private acquisition Marcus had made 8 months prior, an acquisition that had never been disclosed to the board. She had included it as a footnote. Not as an accusation. As data. She had not made the connection consciously, standing in the courtroom. She made it standing at the bathroom sink, cold water on her wrists, looking at the grout. Victor had not called her report incomplete because it was incomplete. He had called it useless because someone in that room needed it to be useless. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She was not ready for what that thought meant yet. But she put it somewhere careful, somewhere she would find it later, and she walked back out into the corridor and went to her desk and opened her laptop and began, quietly and with great thoroughness, to act like a person who had been told she was nothing. It was the smartest thing she'd ever done. Daniel came to her at 4 o'clock, cardigan, worried eyes, a coffee he set on her desk without asking. I should have warned you, he said. About what? Sarah said. He looked at her for a long moment. About what this place does to good work sometimes. He paused. I'm sorry. Don't be, she said. I learned something useful today. She didn't tell him what. Not yet. Outside, the Chicago skyline was doing the thing it did in October, going gray and flat and enormous, like the city was reminding you it had always been bigger than you. She kept her eyes on her screen. She kept counting. 42 days. She stayed for 3 more weeks. This confused people. The other analysts on her floor expected her to quit. She could feel it in the particular way her colleagues avoided making eye contact, not from dislike but from the discomfort of watching someone absorb a public wound and keep moving. It made people uneasy when you didn't fall. They had already decided what shape the story was, and she wasn't following it. She did not follow it on purpose. She stayed because she needed time, and she stayed because leaving immediately would announce that she was running, and she had not yet decided whether what she was doing was running. She was not running. She was gathering. Every evening for those 3 weeks, she stayed at her desk until the floor emptied. She pulled every financial filing the Harlan Group had made public in the last 5 years. She cross-referenced them against the Clearwater data. She traced the two shell companies she'd found in the appendix, Lyndhurst Capital LLC and Briar Gate Holdings, through public incorporation records in Delaware and Wyoming, the two states where rich people went to build walls that looked like doors. She found incorporation dates, registered agents, addresses that were law offices and, not offices, the standard architecture of financial concealment. She did not know yet what she was looking at. She knew its shape before she knew its name. On her last day, a Thursday, gray November, the kind of cold that has already decided it won't apologize, she handed in a resignation letter that said nothing except that she was leaving to pursue other opportunities, which is what resignation letters say when the real reason would require a lawyer to safely articulate. She shook Daniel's hand. He held it a beat too long. His eyes said he was sorry for things he couldn't name. She took the elevator down for the last time. She did not look at herself in the mirror. The 2 years that followed were not glamorous. She needed to be honest about that. She moved into a smaller apartment in Wicker Park, took a consulting position at a mid-size financial advisory firm in the Loop, and worked the kind of hours that leave no room in your head for anything else, which was partly practical and partly architectural. She was building a structure inside herself where the humiliation could live without being the main room. Her friend Lydia Cross, who had been her roommate at Northwestern and was now a paralegal at a downtown firm, came over on Friday nights with cheap wine and the specific kind of loyalty that doesn't require explanation. Lydia was the only person Sarah had told about the court meeting. Not the full version. The edited version, the public humiliation, the dismissal, the word useless said into a room of 20 people and left to echo. Lydia had listened. Then, she'd said, that man declared you useless in front of people who will remember it. Which means either he's an idiot who can't read a good report, or he had a reason to want you to look incompetent. And everything I know about Victor Harlan says he's not an idiot. Sarah had looked at her. I know. You're already pulling the thread, Lydia said. It was not a question. I'm being careful about it. How careful? Careful enough that if something happens to me, it won't look connected. Lydia drank her wine. She didn't look scared. She looked like a person recalibrating. Okay, she said. What do you need? What Sarah needed, it turned out, was a forensic accountant who asked very few questions. She found one through a client referral at her consulting firm, a woman named Patricia Gomez, 50, compact, with the energy of someone who had seen the inside of enough corporate investigations to find almost nothing surprising. Patricia had a small practice on Michigan Avenue that specialized in, as her website delicately put it, complex financial structure analysis. Sarah brought Patricia the shell company data in March of the second year. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, clean, organized, without editorializing. Patricia looked at it for 40 minutes without speaking. Sarah sat across from her in a chair that was slightly too low and watched a woman read numbers the way most people read faces. This is interesting, Patricia said finally. How interesting? The kind of interesting where I need you to understand something clearly before we go further. Patricia put the papers down and looked at Sarah directly. If what I'm seeing is what I think I'm seeing, this connects to a pattern I've encountered twice in my career. Both times, the people who got close to it had problems. She paused. Real problems. Not corporate politics problems. Sarah thought about Marcus Vane in the corridor, noticing her. I know, she said. You keep saying that. Because I keep knowing things and not having proof of them yet. Patricia looked at her for another moment. Then, she picked the papers back up. Give me 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, Sarah kept working her regular job, kept her Friday nights with Lydia, kept the outward shape of a person who had moved on. Inside, she was two people, the one who sat in client meetings and produced clean analysis and received decent performance reviews, and the one who was quietly, methodically dismantling a structure that someone very powerful had spent years building and believed was invisible. The thing about invisible structures is that they leave marks. Not obvious ones. But everything leaves marks. Financial transactions leave breadcrumbs even when they're designed not to. Incorporation documents leave dates. And dates, when you have enough of them and arrange them correctly, tell a story. The story Patricia brought back to her in the second week of May was this: Lyndhurst Capital and Briargate Holdings were not Marcus Vane's companies. They were connected to Marcus through a third entity, a trust established in 2009, the year Victor Harlan's father, Thomas Harlan, died. The trust had been set up ostensibly to manage a portion of Thomas Harlan's estate. But, the trust had a secondary beneficiary structure that ran through Lyndhurst and Briargate, and the assets flowing through that structure had, over 14 years, accumulated to approximately $80 million. $80 million that had moved quietly, consistently, through accounts that had no formal connection to anyone living. Except that Patricia had found the connection. The trust's registered agent was a law firm that also represented Marcus Vane personally. The same law firm had drafted the original Harlan Group shareholder agreement in 1997. The same agreement that determined what happened to a controlling stake in the company if Victor Harlan died without issue or was removed from the board. Sarah sat with this for a long time. Victor Harlan had never married. He had no children. If he died or was removed, the controlling stake was distributed among senior board members according to a formula in the shareholder agreement. Marcus Vane, as the longest-serving senior executive, would have received the largest single portion. $80 million, moved quietly over 14 years, into structures that would activate under specific conditions. Marcus had been waiting. Patiently, methodically, the way people wait when they've decided the outcome is inevitable and the only variable is timing. He was building a war chest, Sarah said. That's one word for it, Patricia said. What happened in 2009? When Thomas Harlan died? Patricia hesitated. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. He was 67. It wasn't investigated. Sarah heard what was not being said. She sat with it, the way she sat with most large things, very still, letting it take up the space it needed to take up without letting it take over. There's something else, Patricia said. Sarah looked at her. The Clearwater acquisition, the one you flagged. It went through, eventually. 3 months after you left. Victor bought it through a subsidiary at a price 11% below what your report valued it at. And, the liability structure you didn't fully analyze in your original report, Patricia set down a page, it was clean. There was nothing there. Someone had already cleaned it before the acquisition closed. Sarah stared at the page. My report wasn't incomplete. No, Patricia said. It was accurate. He knew it was accurate. Yes. He called it useless in front of 20 people because Sarah stopped. The shape of the thing appeared. Not all of it. Enough. She had found the footnote about Marcus. She had buried it in the appendix, but she had found it. And if Victor had read the full report, which Patricia's reconstruction suggested he had, because the acquisition timeline matched Sarah's analysis too precisely to be coincidence, then Victor had known that Sarah had found the thread that led to Marcus. And Victor had stood up in front of his entire court and told everyone in that room, including Marcus Vane, that Sarah Mercer was nobody. That her work was useless. That she was not a threat and not a presence and not worth watching. He had removed her from the board before Marcus could decide she was a problem. She drove home in the kind of daze that isn't actually a daze, it's the feeling of a picture coming into focus that you've been looking at for 2 years from 2 inches away. She parked. She sat in her car for a long time on her street in Wicker Park, watching people walk by with their dogs and their groceries and their entirely uncomplicated evenings. He had saved her life by destroying her reputation. Or he had used her research to clean up a problem and, then, discarded her as convenient cover. Both of those things could be true. That was what made it unbearable, not that the answer was terrible, but that the answer was 2 things at once and she couldn't pull them apart yet. She called Lydia. Are you okay? Lydia said. I found it, Sarah said. A pause. All of it? Not all of it. Enough of it to know that the rest of it exists. She watched a woman across the street wrestle a golden retriever away from a trash can. I need to talk to someone who was in that room. Someone who isn't Marcus. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Daniel Reeves still works there. You said he was decent. He is. Decent people have consciences, Lydia said. Consciences are useful. Sarah looked at the golden retriever. It had one. The woman had given up and was simply walking behind it, holding the leash, going wherever it went. I'm going to need you to help me do something that probably feels reckless, Sarah said. Probably? Lydia said. Come on. You know me better than that. She emailed Daniel that night. Short. Careful. She asked if he would meet her for coffee. No reason given. Just coffee. He replied in 12 minutes. Yes. The speed of it felt like something. She sat with that too. The meeting was at a coffee shop in Evanston, far enough from the loop that it wasn't a place anyone from the Harlan building would casually appear. Daniel arrived before her. Brown cardigan. More gray in his hair than she remembered. He stood when she walked in, which was such a Daniel thing to do that it cracked something open briefly in her chest, and she closed it back quickly. They sat. They ordered. They did the necessary minutes of surface conversation, how are you, the new job, the city in November. Then, Daniel looked at his coffee cup and said, without preamble, I've been wondering when you'd come. Sarah looked at him. Not you specifically, he said. But, someone. He looked up. Victor told me, the week after you left. Not all of it. Enough of it. He folded his hands on the table. I am not a brave person, Sarah. I want you to know that going in. I have a pension. I have a daughter in college. I stayed quiet because the math of my situation told me to stay quiet. I have been ashamed of that math for 2 years. What did Victor tell you? She said. Daniel pressed his lips together. Then, he said it. And, the picture finished coming into focus. Daniel Reeves was not a man who told stories dramatically. He told them the way he wrote reports, linearly, carefully, with a kind of exhausted precision, as though he had rehearsed this version of events many times in private and was only now allowing it an audience. He had been recruited by Thomas Harlan, Victor's father, in 1993. He was 30 years old then, fresh from a small accounting firm in Indianapolis, talented in the specific way that useful people are talented, not brilliant enough to threaten, not mediocre enough to discard. Thomas Harlan liked people like that. He built the inner circle of the company from people like that. People who were good and quiet and had no ambitions that exceeded the room they were given. Marcus Vane had come in a year later. Marcus was not like that. Marcus was the kind of person Thomas Harlan initially mistook for something he could control, which was the central error of Thomas Harlan's career. By the time Thomas understood what Marcus actually was, Marcus was too embedded to remove cleanly, and Thomas was not a man who accepted mess. Thomas had made a different decision. He had begun, quietly, to document. For 5 years, Thomas Harlan kept a private record, not on any company system, not in any place connected to the Harlan Group. A physical record. The kind of evidence that required someone to actually go and get it. He recorded financial irregularities, sourced transactions, noted the shell structures Marcus was quietly constructing. He had not yet taken it to a board, to a regulator, to a lawyer. He was building the kind of case that could not be disputed, the kind that ends careers and, sometimes ends freedom. He died in October 2009. Cardiac arrest, the death certificate said. He was 67. Victor had been 31. He inherited the company and the war already in progress. Victor knew from day one, Daniel said. His coffee was untouched. Thomas left him a letter. Not a full accounting, he hadn't finished the documentation. But, enough. Enough to know what Marcus was, what Marcus had been doing, and that the proof existed somewhere. He paused. Somewhere being the critical word. Thomas had hidden it. He'd hidden it from Marcus, which meant hiding it from everyone, including Victor. Sarah sat very still. Victor spent years looking for the documentation his father left. Yes. While managing Marcus. While keeping Marcus contained. While not being able to move against him because without the documentation, Marcus had enough leverage, enough board relationships, enough that an accusation would look like a power struggle and Marcus would survive it. Daniel looked at his hands. Victor had to play the long game. 14 years of the long game. Keeping Marcus close, keeping him comfortable, making sure he believed he was winning. Sarah thought about Victor's face in the courtroom. The absolute flatness of it. The way he looked at you and put his attention precisely on the place that hurt. She thought about what it cost to maintain that face for 14 years. My report, she said. Daniel nodded slowly. My footnote flagged the shell structures. The Lyndhurst and Briargate connection. Yes. Victor read your report the same afternoon you submitted it. He read the appendix. He understood immediately what you'd found, not everything, but the surface of it. He also understood what it meant that you'd found it. Daniel looked at her directly. You were 3 weeks in. You had no protection. You had no history in that world. If Marcus saw that report, if Marcus understood that a 26-year-old analyst who had been there 40 days had spotted the thread he'd spent a decade burying, Sarah felt the cold of it. He would have decided I was a problem. And Marcus's solutions to problems are not gentle. Daniel said it flatly, without drama. As a fact. The coffee shop noise continued around them, the steam wand, the playlist, the low hum of other people's conversations. Normal sounds from a world that operated on completely different rules. Victor read the report, Sarah said slowly, working it out. He called the court meeting. He invited me, knowing I would present it. And then, in front of Marcus, in front of everyone, he dismantled it. He called it incomplete. He called it useless. He called me not ready. He made you small, Daniel said. In front of the only person it mattered to make you small in front of. He made Marcus look at you and see nothing. And then, he pushed me out. He gave you a reason to leave that had nothing to do with what you'd actually found. In Marcus's eyes, you were a junior analyst who embarrassed herself, learned her lesson, and quit. Not a threat. Not worth following. Not worth anything. Daniel's voice was measured, but his hands, Sarah noticed, were pressed flat on the table in a way that suggested effort. He made you invisible. Sarah breathed through the sensation of 2 years rearranging themselves inside her. The word useless in a room of 20 people. The flatness of his eyes. Not contempt. She had read it as contempt because contempt was a thing she understood, a thing she had a language for. But it had not been contempt. It had been protection, delivered in the only currency Marcus Vane would accept. She should have felt relief. Or something adjacent to it. She sat with the expectation of relief for several days after the conversation with Daniel, waiting for it to arrive. It didn't arrive. What arrived instead was more complicated, a dense, knotted thing made of vindication and loss and a particular species of anger she had no clean name for. The anger was not at Victor. Or it was, but it was also at the situation, at the architecture of it, at the fact that the most effective protection available to her had been indistinguishable from humiliation. That the kindest thing someone could do, in that world, in that room, was to look her in the eye and tell 20 people she was nothing. That the cost of her safety had been her dignity. And he had made that decision without asking her. She sat with this for a long time. She sat with it the way you sit with things that are true and uncomfortable and that require you to hold two opposite feelings without resolving either of them into something tidier. She was grateful and furious. She was vindicated and still wounded. She had been right about her report and it hadn't mattered. She had been saved and it had left a mark. All of that was true at once. None of it canceled the other. In January of the third year, Patricia Gomez completed her full forensic analysis. The documentation was dense, thorough, the kind that required a specialist to read and a non-specialist to feel in their chest rather than understand. $80 million across 14 years. 3 deaths in the Harlan Group's extended orbit: a board member in 2011, a junior attorney in 2014, a regulatory consultant in 2017, each officially natural, each occurring within months of a potential exposure event. Shell structures traceable, with enough work, to Marcus Vane. Patricia had connections. She had spent 30 years building the kind of connections that exist in the specific geography between private finance and public regulatory interest. She introduced Sarah to a contact at the SEC's Enforcement Division, a woman named Christine Park, who listened to 2 hours of presentation without a single visible reaction and, at the end, said, "Send me the full package." Sarah sent it. The process that followed was not cinematic. It was paperwork and waiting and more paperwork and a period of approximately 4 months during which Sarah did not know if anything was happening or if the package had landed in an inbox and been buried under the weight of everything else that needed investigating in the world. She kept working her consulting job. She kept Friday nights with Lydia. She ran 3 miles every other morning because she needed somewhere to put the waiting. In May, Christine Park called. "We've opened a formal inquiry," she said. "You'll be protected as a source. I want to make sure you understand what that means and what it doesn't mean." Sarah understood what it meant. She also understood, standing in her kitchen in Wicker Park, that there was something she needed to do that had nothing to do with the SEC and everything to do with the fact that she was not, finally, the kind of person who let things sit unaddressed. She did not go back to the Harlan building. She wrote a letter. It took her 4 drafts to get it to something she could send. The first draft was too angry. The second draft was too cold. The third draft was too explanatory, full of clauses and justifications, the kind of letter that wants the reader to understand your reasoning when what it actually wants is for the reader to feel the weight of what happened. She threw out the third draft entirely. The fourth draft was short. It said, "I found what you were looking for. The full documentation is with the SEC. You should hear from Christine Park's office within 60 days. I know why you did what you did in October. I understand the logic of it. I want you to know that understanding the logic of something and being okay with it are 2 different things. You made a decision about my life without giving me the information to make it myself. That wasn't protection. That was control. I'm not writing to accuse you or to forgive you. I'm writing because I spent 2 years believing I was wrong about my own work, and I wasn't. I think you should know that the person you tried to make invisible is the reason this is over." Sarah Mercer. She sent it to his personal email address, which Daniel had given her without being asked. She waited 3 days. On the 3rd day, she received a reply. It was shorter than her letter. It said, "You weren't wrong about the work. You were never wrong about the work. The rest I have no argument against. VH." She read it twice. She set her phone face down on the kitchen counter. She stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at nothing, and thought about the word useless in a room of 20 people, and thought about all the rooms in all the buildings in all the cities where women were told they were nothing by men who were either too stupid to see them or, worse, too afraid of what seeing them would cost. Both versions happen. Both versions are real. The world contains both. She picked up her phone. She went for a run. Marcus Vane was formally charged in September of that year. The charges were extensive. The trial took 14 months. Sarah was called as a witness in the 3rd week, sat in a chair and answered questions in a room with different furniture but the same basic architecture as every powerful room she'd ever been in, and spoke clearly about what she had found and when she had found it and how, and did not look at Marcus across the courtroom more than twice. The second time she looked at him, he was looking at her. He had the expression of a man encountering something he had classified as nothing and been wrong about. She held his gaze for 4 seconds. Then, she looked back at the attorney asking questions and continued to answer them. Marcus was convicted on 11 counts. He received a sentence that made the financial press uncomfortable in the way financial press is always uncomfortable when someone from a certain altitude falls all the way down. Daniel retired 6 months later. He sent Sarah a card, an actual physical card, the kind people her parents' age still sent, that said simply, "You did a good thing." I should have done it years ago. I'm glad you were braver than me. She kept the card. She put it in the drawer of her desk at the consulting firm, which by then had promoted her to a senior position, because she had turned out, it seemed, to be precisely as useful as she had always known she was. She saw Victor once more. She did not plan it. She was at an industry event in the spring, 2 years after the trial, one of those evenings that exist for the purpose of people circulating through a room and reminding each other that they exist. She was talking to a client when she felt a shift in the room's temperature, the particular way a room adjusts when a certain person enters, and she looked up without meaning to. He was across the room. He had aged 4 years in a way that was visible, slightly. He was talking to someone, not looking at her. Then, he was looking at her. The distance was 20 feet. There was no way to have a conversation across it, which meant the only thing that passed between them was recognition, the specific, loaded kind, the kind that contains too much to compress into a nod or a wave. She nodded once, anyway. He nodded back. She turned back to her client and resumed the conversation. She did not turn around again. She didn't need to. Some things complete themselves without resolution. Some stories don't end, they simply arrive at a place where you can stop carrying them. Sarah Mercer had walked into a glass tower at 26 and been told, in front of 20 people, that she was nothing. She had walked out of that tower and spent 3 years proving the sentence wrong, not for the room that had heard it, not for the man who had spoken it, but because the truth had been sitting in her appendix the whole time, waiting for someone willing to follow it all the way to the end. She had followed it. That was the whole story. That was all of it. She went home that night through a city that was bright and cold and enormous in the way cities are enormous when you're not scared of them anymore, and she made herself dinner, and she ate it at her kitchen table, and she did not count the days. She didn't need to count anymore.